Tonight we begin with a revelation that will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval history. The Vikings weren't just raiders with axes and attitude. They were the architects of the first truly global economy, master shipbuilders who revolutionized maritime technology, and the founders of empires that shaped the political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to discover how a handful of Scandinavian seafarers fundamentally transformed the entire world. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this journey through the forgotten corridors of history. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to witness the untold story of how the Vikings changed everything. Not through conquest alone, but through innovation, trade, and a maritime revolution that connected continents for the first time in human history. Picture this. It's the year 793, and most of Europe is struggling in the aftermath of Rome's collapse. Trade routes have withered, cities have shrunk, and the continent feels more isolated than it has in centuries. Silver is scarce, luxury goods are almost impossible to obtain, and communication between distant regions happens at the pace of a walking messenger. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, sleek vessels with distinctive square sails begin appearing on rivers and coastlines across the known world. These aren't just any ships. They're floating masterpieces of engineering that can navigate both stormy seas and shallow rivers with equal grace. The men aboard these vessels aren't just warriors, though they can fight when necessary. They're merchants, explorers, and entrepreneurs who are about to weave together a commercial network spanning from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of the Middle East. They'll establish trading posts that become the foundations of major European cities, create political structures that influence the development of entire nations, and develop technologies that won't be matched for centuries. By the time their age draws to a close, they'll have fundamentally rewired the economic and political map of the medieval world. This is the real story of the Vikings, not the Hollywood version of bloodthirsty barbarians, but the archaeological reality of sophisticated maritime innovators who became the world's first truly international merchants. Their influence reaches so deep into the foundations of modern civilization that we're still uncovering the extent of their impact through genetic studies, linguistic analysis, and archaeological discoveries that continue to rewrite history books. The foundation of this transformation rests entirely on one revolutionary innovation that changed naval architecture forever: Viking shipbuilding technology. Specifically, a construction technique called clinker building, known in Norwegian as klinkbygging. This wasn't just a different way to build boats. It was a structural breakthrough that created vessels unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Here's how it worked. While most European shipbuilders were constructing vessels with thick, heavy hulls, using a technique called carvel building, where planks were placed edge to edge, the Vikings developed something entirely different. They overlapped their wooden planks like scales on a fish, securing each overlap with iron rivets. This created a hull that was simultaneously incredibly strong and remarkably flexible. When waves struck a clinker-built ship, the overlapping planks could flex and bend with the motion of the water instead of fighting against it. The result was revolutionary. These ships could handle rough seas that would destroy other vessels, and they were significantly faster than anything else on the water. Archaeological evidence from ship burials, like the famous Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904, reveals the sophisticated craftsmanship involved in this technique. The Oseberg ship, dating to around 820 CE, demonstrates construction methods so advanced that modern naval architects still marvel at the engineering principles involved. But the Vikings didn't stop at just building strong, fast ships. They designed different types of vessels for different purposes, revealing a deep understanding of specialized maritime needs that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The longship, or langskip, was their weapon of war and exploration. These vessels were narrow, typically measuring between 20 and 30 meters in length, but only about 3 meters wide. This extreme length-to-width ratio gave them incredible speed under both sail and oar power. Archaeological reconstructions have proven that these ships could achieve remarkable speeds. The Sea Stallion from Glendalough, a modern reconstruction of a Viking longship found in Roskilde Fjord, has reached speeds over 20 knots in optimal conditions. To put that in perspective, that's faster than many modern sailing yachts, and absolutely unheard of for medieval vessels. The shallow draft design was perhaps even more important than the speed. Viking longships drew less than 1 meter of water when fully loaded, allowing them to navigate rivers that other ships couldn't even attempt. This meant Vikings could sail their ocean-going vessels hundreds of miles inland, appearing suddenly in the heart of continental Europe, where no one expected seaborne raiders or traders to reach. For long-distance trade, the Vikings developed a completely different type of vessel called the nar. These were wider, deeper ships designed for carrying cargo rather than warriors. A typical nar could transport up to 40 tons of goods while still maintaining the seaworthiness necessary for oceanic voyages. Archaeological evidence from the Skåldelev ships, discovered in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark during the 1960s, reveals 5 different Viking vessels that had been deliberately sunk to block the fjord. Among them were both longships and nars, providing detailed evidence of how these different ship types were constructed and used. The construction materials themselves tell a fascinating story of Viking resourcefulness and environmental adaptation. Early Viking ships were built primarily from oak, which provided incredible strength and durability. A single longship required approximately 3 large oak trees, representing a significant investment in both materials and labour. However, as Viking shipbuilding expanded and oak became scarcer in some regions, Norse shipwrights adapted their techniques to local resources. By the 10th century, while Danish shipbuilders continued using oak, their Norwegian and Swedish counterparts had successfully transitioned to pine construction. This adaptation required modifications to construction techniques, but it allowed Viking shipbuilding to continue even as preferred materials became less available. The fact that these ships maintained their performance characteristics while using different materials demonstrates the sophisticated understanding Viking shipwrights had of structural engineering principles. The tools and techniques required for this construction reveal another layer of Viking technological innovation. The increase in iron production during the later Viking Age was crucial for shipbuilding advancement. Vikings exploited bog ore, a form of iron ore found in wetland areas, to smelt metal for tools, weapons, and most importantly, the thousands of iron rivets required for clinker construction. Each rivet had to be individually forged and fitted, requiring skilled metalworking and precise craftsmanship. Archaeological analysis of Viking ship rivets reveals consistent metallurgical techniques and standardized sizes, suggesting organized production methods and quality control that rivals modern manufacturing principles. The combination of abundant forest resources and advanced metallurgy created the perfect conditions for the Vikings to become medieval Europe's premier shipbuilders. The vast forests of Norway provided seemingly unlimited timber, while innovations in iron production supplied the metal components necessary for advanced construction techniques. This technological foundation enabled the Vikings to achieve something unprecedented in medieval Europe. They created vessels that could transition seamlessly between different maritime environments. The same ship that could cross the North Atlantic in heavy seas could also navigate the shallow rivers of Eastern Europe, opening up trade routes that had been impossible for any previous civilization to exploit. The performance capabilities of these vessels were extraordinary for their time. Under oar power alone, the largest longships could maintain speeds of 5 to 6 knots for extended periods. Under sail in favourable conditions, they could reach 10 knots or more. But speed was only part of their advantage. The shallow draft allowed beach landings on any suitable shore, eliminating the need for port facilities. The light weight of the clinker construction meant the ships could be carried overland when necessary, allowing Vikings to portage between river systems and access inland waterways that seemed completely isolated from seaborne traffic. Archaeological evidence proves that Viking ships reached an astonishing range of destinations. From the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, from the rivers of Russia to the coast of North America, these vessels carried Norse traders, explorers, and settlers to every corner of the known world and beyond. The discovery of distinctly Scandinavian artifacts in locations as diverse as Constantinople, Baghdad, and Newfoundland demonstrates the global reach that Viking maritime technology made possible. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking shipbuilding was how it enabled a complete transformation in European trade networks. Before the Viking Age, European commerce was still recovering from the collapse of Roman trade systems. Regional markets existed, but long-distance trade was limited, expensive, and extremely risky. The Vikings changed all of that by creating vessels that could reliably transport goods over vast distances while maintaining the flexibility to access markets that had never been connected to international trade networks. This maritime revolution was about to transform not just Scandinavian society, but the entire economic structure of medieval Europe. The ships were ready. The technology existed. Now all that remained was for Viking merchants and explorers to use these remarkable vessels to create something the world had never seen before. A truly global trade network that would connect continents, establish empires, and fundamentally reshape the political and economic landscape of the medieval world. The stage was set for the Vikings to change everything, and change everything they did, one perfectly crafted, clinker-built ship at a time. The ships were revolutionary, but they were useless without destinations. And this is where the Vikings revealed their true genius. They weren't just building better boats, they were systematically identifying and exploiting trade opportunities that no one else had even recognized existed. While most of medieval Europe was still thinking in terms of local markets and regional exchange, the Vikings were already operating on a global scale. The transformation began with silver. Specifically, Islamic silver dirhams minted in the great cities of the Abbasid Caliphate. By the 9th century, these coins were flowing into Scandinavia in quantities so vast that archaeologists are still uncovering hordes of them today. But here's what makes this remarkable. The silver wasn't arriving through established Roman trade routes, which had largely collapsed centuries earlier. It was coming through entirely new pathways that the Vikings had carved out themselves. The eastern route was perhaps their most audacious achievement. Starting from the Baltic Sea, Viking traders would sail their shallow draft vessels up rivers that penetrated deep into what we now call Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Volga River became their highway to the Caspian Sea, while the Dnieper River system provided access to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. These weren't short trading expeditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking merchants were making round trips of over 4,000 miles, crossing multiple climate zones and navigating through territories controlled by dozens of different political entities. The logistical complexity of these operations was staggering. When rivers became too shallow, or when waterfalls blocked their path, Viking traders would literally carry their ships overland. Portages of several miles were routine, requiring coordinated teams of men to haul fully loaded vessels across difficult terrain. The fact that this was economically viable tells us something crucial about the profit margins involved in this long-distance trade. Archaeological excavations at trading sites along these river routes reveal the international character of Viking commerce. At Staraya Ladoga, one of the earliest Viking trading posts in Russia, excavators have found artifacts from across the known world. Arabic coins, Byzantine jewellery, Chinese silk, Indian beads, and Arctic walrus ivory all appear in the same archaeological layers, proving that this wasn't regional trade, but truly global commerce. The trading post at Berka, located on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, provides even more dramatic evidence of Viking commercial sophistication. Active from approximately 750 to 975 CE, Berka functioned as an international marketplace, where goods from across Eurasia were bought, sold, and redistributed. Archaeological analysis of the site has revealed over 3,000 graves, many containing grave goods that trace the global reach of Viking trade networks. What's fascinating is the diversity of the population at Berka. DNA analysis of skeletal remains has revealed individuals with ancestry from across Northern and Eastern Europe, suggesting that this wasn't just a Scandinavian trading post, but a truly cosmopolitan commercial centre. Some graves contain individuals who were clearly not of Scandinavian origin, but who were buried with full honours alongside local merchants and craftsmen. The goods flowing through these networks tell the story of cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Northbound cargoes included Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, spices from India and beyond, wine from the Mediterranean, and luxury goods that had travelled along the Silk Road from as far away as China. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia includes Chinese silk, with distinctive weaving patterns that can be traced to specific regions of Tang Dynasty China. Southbound, Viking merchants carried products of the north that were in high demand in warmer climates. Amber from the Baltic shores was prized throughout the Islamic world and Byzantium. Furs from the Arctic regions of Scandinavia commanded premium prices in the markets of Baghdad and Constantinople. Walrus ivory, obtained from expeditions to the Arctic, was valued as highly as elephant ivory in regions where elephants were unknown. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of Viking trade was human trafficking. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that Vikings participated in the slave trade on a massive scale, capturing people during raids and then selling them in international markets. The Arabic term sakaliba, referring to Slavic slaves, appears frequently in Islamic commercial documents from this period. Slave markets in Dublin, York, and other Viking-controlled cities became major sources of human chattel for buyers throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The economic impact of this trade was transformative. The massive influx of Islamic silver into Northern Europe provided the liquidity necessary for economic expansion that hadn't been seen since the height of the Roman Empire. Hoards of Arabic silver coins found throughout Scandinavia contain tens of thousands of individual pieces, representing wealth accumulations that would have been impossible under the previous barter-based economy. This silver circulation created something entirely new in medieval Europe, a standardized monetary system that operated across vast distances. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating silver content, often cutting coins into pieces to create exact weights for specific transactions. This hack silver system allowed for precise commercial exchanges that weren't dependent on the political authority of any particular kingdom or empire. The trading centres that emerged to support these networks became the foundation for many of Europe's major cities. Hedeby, located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, controlled the crucial connection between the Baltic and North Seas. At its peak, this city housed approximately 1,000 permanent residents, making it one of the largest urban centres in Northern Europe. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated urban planning, including designated areas for different crafts and industries. York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, demonstrates how these trading centres could transform existing settlements. When Vikings captured York in 866 CE, it was a struggling Anglo-Saxon town. Under Viking control, it became one of the most prosperous cities in medieval England. Archaeological evidence from Coppergate and other sites in York reveals intensive manufacturing activities, including metalworking, textile production, leatherworking, and bone carving. The city became a major centre for redistributing goods imported through Viking trade networks to markets throughout Britain and Ireland. The Varangian route, connecting Scandinavia with Byzantium through the river systems of Eastern Europe, represents perhaps the most ambitious commercial undertaking of the medieval period. This wasn't just a trade route, but a complete transportation infrastructure that required diplomatic agreements with multiple political entities, the establishment of secure storage facilities, and the maintenance of navigational knowledge across thousands of miles of waterways. Byzantine sources confirm the importance of this connection. The Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the 10th century, describes in detail how the Rus, as the Vikings were known in the East, arrived annually in Constantinople with massive fleets of ships loaded with goods from the north. These trading expeditions involved hundreds of vessels and thousands of participants, representing commercial operations on a scale that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the rise of the Italian maritime republics centuries later. The political implications of these trading relationships were profound. Viking merchants didn't just buy and sell goods, they became power brokers, military advisors, and political influencers in the regions where they operated. The Varangian Guard, an elite military unit composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. These weren't just mercenaries, but trusted advisors who influenced imperial policy and accumulated enormous wealth through their service. The cultural exchange facilitated by these networks was equally significant. Arabic inscriptions have been found on Viking artifacts in Scandinavia, while Norse runes appear on objects discovered as far east as the Volga River basin. This wasn't one-way cultural transmission, but genuine exchange that influenced art, technology, and social practices across multiple civilizations. Religious syncretism also occurred along these trade routes. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking merchants adopted Islamic practices while maintaining traditional Norse beliefs, creating hybrid religious systems that reflect the cosmopolitan nature of these commercial networks. Similarly, Islamic merchants operating in Scandinavian markets seem to have adapted their practices to local customs while maintaining their essential religious identity. The technological transfer facilitated by these networks accelerated innovation across multiple fields. Metallurgical techniques, navigation methods, textile production, and agricultural practices all spread along Viking trade routes, contributing to technological advancement throughout medieval Europe. The Vikings themselves adopted and adapted innovations they encountered, creating synthetic technologies that were often superior to their original sources. By the 10th century, Viking trade networks had effectively rebuilt the European economy on foundations that were more extensive and more resilient than anything that had existed during the Roman period. These weren't centrally controlled imperial systems, but flexible, adaptive networks that could respond quickly to changing political and economic conditions. When one route became unavailable due to political conflicts, alternative pathways could be rapidly developed and exploited. The scale of wealth accumulation that resulted from these activities was unprecedented in post-Roman Europe. Hoards of silver buried throughout Scandinavia represent individual fortunes that exceeded the treasuries of most European kingdoms. This wealth wasn't just accumulated by kings and jarls, but by merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses within these international networks. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these trading systems was their durability. While political entities rose and fell, while kingdoms conquered and were conquered, the essential trading relationships established by the Vikings persisted for centuries. The commercial connections they created became the foundation for the medieval European economy and established patterns of exchange that influenced European development long after the Viking Age had ended. The Vikings hadn't just created better ships and established new trade routes. They had fundamentally reimagined what was possible in terms of long-distance commerce and cultural exchange. And they were just getting started. Getting started. The networks they had established were just the beginning. What the Vikings created next would reshape the political map of Europe in ways that still influence our world today. While historians have traditionally focused on Viking raids and conquests, the archaeological evidence reveals something far more profound. The Vikings weren't just taking from existing civilizations, they were building new ones from scratch. The most remarkable example of this empire building occurred in the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, where Swedish Vikings, known in this region as the Varangians or Rus, established what would become the foundation of the Russian state itself. This wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. Archaeological evidence suggests it was more akin to a gradual commercial and political integration that transformed the entire region. The story begins around 750 CE with the establishment of Aldigja, known today as Staraya Ladoga, along the Volkhov River. This wasn't just another trading post. Excavations at the site have revealed a sophisticated settlement with evidence of intensive metalworking, bead production, and craft specialization that far exceeded anything else in the region. The archaeological layers clearly show Scandinavian-style buildings, constructed using techniques unknown in Slavic regions, alongside local Slavic and Finnic structures, creating a genuinely multicultural community. What makes this development extraordinary is how quickly these settlements grew in both size and political importance. By 862 CE, according to the primary chronicle, a Viking leader named Rurik had established himself as the ruler of Novgorod, one of the key trading centers along the route between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Archaeological evidence from Novgorod supports this account, revealing layers of Scandinavian material culture that appear suddenly in the archaeological record during this period. The genetic evidence is equally compelling. Recent DNA studies of medieval remains from these regions show significant Scandinavian ancestry appearing in the population during the 9th and 10th centuries, but not in patterns consistent with military conquest. Instead, the genetic data suggest gradual integration through trade relationships, intermarriage, and voluntary settlement. This was cultural fusion, not cultural domination. The political structures that emerged from this process were unprecedented in Eastern Europe. The Vikings brought with them sophisticated legal traditions, administrative practices, and commercial techniques that had been developed through their extensive trading networks. The Ruskaya Pravda, one of the earliest legal codes in Eastern Europe, shows clear influences from Scandinavian legal traditions while incorporating local Slavic customs. Perhaps most significantly, these Viking settlements established the political framework that would eventually become the Kievan Rus, the medieval state that historians consider the predecessor to both Russia and Ukraine. This wasn't a temporary trading arrangement or a short-lived conquest. It was the foundation of a political entity that would endure for centuries and profoundly influence the development of Eastern European civilization. The archaeological evidence from Kiev itself tells a remarkable story of urban transformation. When Vikings gained control of the city in the late 9th century, it was a modest settlement with perhaps a few hundred inhabitants. Under Viking leadership, it grew into one of the largest cities in medieval Europe, with a population that may have exceeded 50,000 at its peak. The scale of this urban development required sophisticated planning, extensive resource mobilization, and administrative capabilities that demonstrate the Vikings' capacity for large-scale political organization. The economic foundation of this Eastern European empire was silver. Massive quantities of Islamic silver coins flowed north through these Viking-controlled territories, creating wealth accumulations that funded further expansion and political consolidation. Hoards discovered throughout the region contained thousands of Arabic dirhams, representing treasure accumulations that exceeded the resources of most Western European kingdoms. But the Vikings weren't content to limit their empire building to Eastern Europe. In the West, they were simultaneously establishing another political entity that would have even more dramatic long-term consequences for European history. The settlement of Normandy represents perhaps the most successful example of Viking political adaptation in medieval Europe. The foundation of Norman power began in 911 CE when the Viking leader Rollo negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. Archaeological evidence from Rouen and other Norman centres shows that this wasn't simply a military occupation. The Vikings, who settled in Normandy, rapidly adopted Frankish administrative practices, Christian religious traditions, and local agricultural techniques, while maintaining their maritime expertise and military effectiveness. The genetic evidence from Normandy reveals a fascinating pattern of cultural integration. DNA studies of medieval Norman remains show significant Scandinavian ancestry, but also substantial integration with local Frankish populations. Within 2 generations, the Norman population had become genetically indistinguishable from their neighbours, while maintaining distinct cultural practices that reflected their Viking heritage. The political innovations that emerged from Norman society would reshape European history. Norman administrative techniques, legal traditions, and military practices spread throughout medieval Europe as Norman nobles established themselves in England, Sicily, southern Italy, and even the Crusader states of the Middle East. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 alone represents one of the most significant political transformations in European history. Archaeological evidence from Norman England reveals the scale of this transformation. The construction of hundreds of stone castles, the establishment of new administrative centres, and the implementation of the Domesday Book Survey all demonstrate Norman organisational capabilities that far exceeded those of their Viking ancestors. Yet genetic studies reveal that the Norman invasion involved relatively few actual settlers, suggesting that their success was based on superior organisation and administration rather than numerical superiority. The Norman influence extended far beyond England. Norman adventurers established kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy that became major Mediterranean powers. Archaeological excavations at Palermo and other Norman centres in Sicily reveal sophisticated urban planning, advanced agricultural techniques, and cultural fusion that incorporated Islamic, Byzantine, and Western European traditions. Even more remarkably, Normans participated in the Crusades not just as warriors, but as administrators and state builders. The Principality of Antioch, established by Norman Crusaders, demonstrated the same organisational capabilities that had made Norman expansion successful in Western Europe. Archaeological evidence from Antioch shows sophisticated fortification systems, urban development projects, and commercial facilities that reflect advanced political and military organisation. The Viking expansion into the North Atlantic represents yet another dimension of their empire-building capabilities. The settlement of Iceland, beginning in 874 CE, created the first European democracy, with political institutions that were far more sophisticated than anything existing in mainland Europe. The Althing, established in 930 CE, was a parliamentary assembly that provided legal representation for free farmers across the entire island. Archaeological evidence from Iceland reveals the remarkable scale of this settlement project. Within a century, the Viking colonists had established farms throughout the habitable portions of the island, developed sophisticated livestock management systems, and created trade networks that connected Iceland with Norway, Ireland, and even continental Europe. The environmental archaeology shows that this settlement required careful resource management and agricultural innovation that demonstrates advanced planning capabilities. The Icelandic legal system, preserved in manuscripts like the Gragas, provides detailed evidence of Viking political sophistication. These weren't simple warrior codes, but comprehensive legal frameworks that addressed everything from property rights to commercial disputes to family law. The fact that these legal traditions were developed and maintained without centralized royal authority demonstrates the Vikings' capacity for creating stable political institutions based on consensus and voluntary cooperation. From Iceland, Viking expansion continued to Greenland, where Eric the Red established settlements around 986 CE that would endure for nearly 500 years. Archaeological evidence from sites like Brattahlid reveals sophisticated adaptation to one of the world's most challenging environments. The Greenland Vikings developed specialized hunting techniques, innovative construction methods, and trade relationships that extended back to Europe and possibly to North America. The genetic evidence from Greenland is particularly fascinating. DNA analysis of medieval remains shows not only Scandinavian ancestry, but also genetic contributions from Inuit populations, suggesting cultural and biological exchange between Viking settlers and indigenous Arctic peoples. This genetic mixing represents cultural adaptation on a scale that contradicts traditional narratives of Viking expansion as purely European colonization. The culmination of Viking exploration occurred with their arrival in North America around 1000 CE. The archaeological site at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland provides unambiguous evidence of Viking presence in North America, including distinctly Scandinavian building techniques, ironworking activities, and artifacts that can be directly linked to Greenland and Iceland. Recent archaeological discoveries have expanded our understanding of the Viking presence in North America. Excavations at Point Rosie and other sites suggest that Viking exploration may have extended further south along the North American coast than previously thought. While these sites require additional investigation, they indicate that Viking exploration of North America was more extensive than the limited settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows suggests. The genetic evidence for Viking contact with indigenous North American populations is still being investigated, but preliminary studies suggest possible European genetic contributions to some Native American populations that predate later European colonization. If confirmed, this would represent the earliest documented genetic exchange between European and American populations. What makes these empire-building achievements particularly remarkable is that they occurred simultaneously across multiple continents. While Vikings were establishing the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe, founding Normandy in France, settling Iceland and Greenland, and exploring North America, they were also maintaining their extensive trade networks and continuing their raids throughout Western Europe. This required organizational capabilities and resource management skills that far exceeded anything demonstrated by other medieval European peoples. The political institutions created by these Viking expansions shared several common characteristics that distinguish them from other medieval political systems. They typically featured more democratic decision-making processes, greater legal protections for ordinary citizens, and more flexible administrative structures than the rigid feudal hierarchies that dominated much of medieval Europe. The economic foundations of these Viking polities were also distinctive. Rather than relying primarily on agricultural surplus or tribute extraction, Viking political entities were typically based on trade revenues, craft production, and resource exploitation. This created more dynamic economies that could adapt quickly to changing conditions and opportunities. The cultural impact of these Viking political entities was equally significant. They served as conduits for cultural exchange between different regions and civilizations, facilitating the transmission of ideas, technologies, and artistic styles across vast distances. The cosmopolitan character of Viking trading centers created environments where innovation flourished and cultural boundaries became fluid. Perhaps most importantly, these Viking empires demonstrated alternative models for political organization that influenced later European development. The democratic traditions established in Iceland, the administrative innovations developed in Normandy, and the commercial practices pioneered along the Eastern European river routes all contributed to the evolution of European political culture. The genetic legacy of these expansions is still visible today. DNA studies reveal Scandinavian genetic contributions in populations throughout the former Viking world, from the British Isles to Eastern Europe to the North Atlantic islands. But this genetic evidence also shows that Viking expansion involved significant cultural integration rather than simple population replacement. The linguistic evidence is equally compelling. Old Norse loanwords appear in languages throughout the former Viking world, but the patterns of linguistic borrowing suggest extensive cultural interaction rather than linguistic domination. In England, for example, Old Norse contributed hundreds of words to Middle English, including basic vocabulary related to law, government, and daily life. The archaeological evidence reveals that Viking political entities were characterized by sophisticated urban planning, advanced craft production, and extensive trade networks that connected local communities with global markets. These weren't primitive warrior societies, but complex political organizations that successfully competed with the most advanced civilizations of their time. By the 11th century, the Vikings had created a network of political entities that stretched across the known world and beyond. These weren't temporary conquests or trading posts, but permanent political structures that influenced the development of European civilization for centuries. The hidden empires built by the Vikings represent one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval history, demonstrating organizational capabilities and cultural adaptability that transformed the political landscape of Europe and the North Atlantic. The stage was now set for the final phase of Viking influence on world history. Their ships had opened new trade routes, their merchants had created global commercial networks, and their political leaders had established empires across multiple continents. But perhaps their most lasting impact would come through an institution that seemed to contradict everything people thought they knew about Viking society. An elite military unit that would serve the Byzantine Empire and demonstrate once and for all that the Vikings were far more than raiders or traders. They were the medieval world's most adaptable and sophisticated military professionals. The Varangian Guard represents perhaps the most remarkable transformation in Viking history. Here were the same warriors who had once terrorized the coastlines of Europe, now serving as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor, the most powerful ruler in the medieval world. This wasn't just a career change. It was proof that Viking society had evolved into something far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The story begins in the late 10th century, when Viking merchants traveling the Dnieper route to Constantinople began offering their services as soldiers to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, locked in constant warfare with Arab forces, Bulgarian kingdoms, and internal rebellions, desperately needed reliable military forces. What they discovered in the Vikings was something unprecedented in medieval warfare. Professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than land or political allegiance. The first major Viking military expedition to Byzantium occurred in 988 CE, when Prince Vladimir I of Kiev sent 6,000 warriors to assist Emperor Basil II in suppressing a rebellion led by Bardas Phocas. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe these Viking warriors with a mixture of admiration and shock. John Skylitzes, a Byzantine historian, wrote that the northern warriors fought with a ferocity and discipline that surpassed even the empire's legendary Scholae Palatinae. What made the Vikings so effective wasn't just their individual combat skills, but their ability to function as a coordinated military unit. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites suggests that Viking warriors fought in tight formations using standardized weapons and armor. This represented a significant evolution from the loose raiding bands that had characterized earlier Viking military activities. The success of this initial military cooperation led Emperor Basil II to formalize the arrangement by creating the Varangian Guard around 988 CE. This elite unit, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, became the emperor's personal bodyguard and the empire's most trusted military force. Byzantine administrative documents from this period show that Varangian guardsmen received higher pay than any other military unit in the empire, along with special privileges and access to the imperial court. The archaeological evidence from Constantinople reveals the remarkable integration of these Viking warriors into Byzantine society. Excavations in the city have uncovered Scandinavian-style weapons and personal ornaments in contexts that clearly indicate long-term residence rather than temporary military service. Runic inscriptions carved into the marble balustrades of Hagia Sophia by Varangian guardsmen provide direct evidence of their presence in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. One of the most famous of these inscriptions, discovered in 1964, reads, "Halfdan carved these runes," proving that individual Vikings were literate and confident enough to leave permanent marks in one of the empire's most sacred buildings. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis confirm that these inscriptions date to the 11th century, during the height of Varangian influence in Constantinople. The military campaigns undertaken by the Varangian Guard demonstrate the global reach of Viking military service. Byzantine chronicles record Varangian participation in campaigns from southern Italy to the Caucasus Mountains, from the Danube frontier to the deserts of Syria. These weren't just European conflicts, but truly international military operations that required logistical coordination across thousands of miles. The most famous Varangian guardsman was undoubtedly Harald Hardrada, who served in the unit from approximately 1034 to 1043 CE before returning to Norway to claim the throne. Byzantine sources describe Harald's military exploits in extraordinary detail, including campaigns in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. The wealth he accumulated during his Varangian service was legendary even by medieval standards. When he finally returned to Scandinavia, Harald brought with him treasure estimated by contemporary sources to exceed the annual revenues of most European kingdoms. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts of Varangian wealth accumulation. Hoards discovered throughout Scandinavia contain Byzantine gold coins, silk textiles, and luxury goods that can be directly traced to imperial workshops in Constantinople. The quantity and quality of these artifacts suggest that Varangian service provided access to wealth sources that were completely unavailable through traditional Scandinavian economic activities. The genetic evidence from this period reveals fascinating patterns of population movement and cultural integration. DNA studies of medieval remains from both Scandinavia and the Byzantine territories show genetic mixing that coincides chronologically with the Varangian Guard period. This suggests that many Vikings who travelled south for military service eventually settled permanently in the Byzantine Empire, while others returned to Scandinavia and brought Byzantine wives and cultural practices back with them. The linguistic evidence is equally compelling. Old Norse loanwords appear in Middle Byzantine Greek texts from this period, particularly military and administrative terminology. Conversely, Greek loanwords began appearing in Scandinavian runic inscriptions, indicating genuine cultural exchange rather than simple military occupation. The administrative records of the Varangian Guard reveal sophisticated organizational structures that contradict traditional assumptions about Viking military culture. These warriors weren't savage berserkers, but disciplined professional soldiers who operated within complex bureaucratic systems. Promotion within the Guard was based on merit and experience, with detailed records kept of individual service records and achievements. The most remarkable aspect of Varangian service was how it transformed Viking military culture itself. Warriors who returned to Scandinavia brought with them advanced military techniques, siege warfare knowledge, and strategic thinking that had been developed through service in one of the world's most sophisticated military organizations. This technological and tactical transfer contributed significantly to the military evolution of Scandinavian kingdoms during the later Viking Age. The Varangian Guard also served as a diplomatic bridge between the Byzantine Empire and the emerging kingdoms of Northern and Eastern Europe. Guard members often served as interpreters, negotiators, and cultural intermediaries in complex international relationships. Their unique position as trusted imperial servants who maintained connections to their Scandinavian homelands made them invaluable assets in Byzantine foreign policy. The religious implications of Varangian service were equally significant. Many Vikings converted to Orthodox Christianity during their service in Constantinople, bringing these new religious ideas back to Scandinavia upon their return. Archaeological evidence from late Viking Age burial sites shows increasing Christian influence in funeral practices, often combined with traditional Norse elements in syncretic religious expressions. By the mid-11th century, the Varangian Guard had become one of the most prestigious military appointments in the medieval world. Service in the Guard was actively sought by warriors from across Scandinavia, representing the pinnacle of military achievement for ambitious young men. The social status associated with Varangian service elevated the families of guardsmen and contributed to the development of a military aristocracy in Scandinavian societies. The economic impact of Varangian service extended far beyond individual wealth accumulation. The regular flow of Byzantine gold and silver into Scandinavia through returning guardsmen provided additional liquidity for Northern European economies that were already benefiting from extensive trade networks. This monetary circulation contributed to urbanization, craft specialization, and commercial development throughout the Viking world. The technological transfer facilitated by Varangian service was particularly important in military engineering and siege warfare. Vikings who served in Byzantine campaigns gained experience with advanced siege equipment, fortification techniques, and naval warfare strategies that were far more sophisticated than traditional Scandinavian military practices. Archaeological evidence from later Viking Age fortifications shows clear Byzantine influence in construction techniques and defensive planning. The cultural impact of the Varangian Guard extended beyond military and economic spheres to influence art, literature, and social customs throughout Scandinavia. Returning guardsmen brought with them Byzantine artistic styles, decorative techniques, and cultural practices that became integrated into Scandinavian material culture. Archaeological analysis of late Viking Age artifacts reveals clear Byzantine influences in metalwork, textile production, and decorative arts. The decline of the Varangian Guard began in the late 11th century as political changes in both Byzantium and Scandinavia reduced the flow of Viking recruits to Constantinople. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 eliminated one major source of Varangian guardsmen, while the Christianization and political consolidation of Scandinavian kingdoms reduced the number of warriors seeking service abroad. However, the institution persisted in modified form well into the 12th century, gradually becoming more international as Byzantine recruitment expanded to include warriors from other regions. The last definitively Scandinavian references to Varangian service appear in sources from the early 12th century, marking the end of this remarkable chapter in Viking history. The legacy of the Varangian Guard demonstrates the extraordinary adaptability of Viking military culture. These warriors successfully transitioned from raiders operating in small bands to professional soldiers serving in one of the world's most sophisticated military organizations. This transformation required not just individual courage, but institutional learning, cultural adaptation, and technological innovation that contradicts simplistic narratives of Viking society. The archaeological evidence from Varangian Guard service sites throughout the Byzantine Empire reveals the global scope of Viking military influence during this period. From the Italian campaigns against Arab forces to the frontier wars in the Caucasus, Viking warriors participated in military operations that shaped the political development of medieval Europe and the Middle East. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Varangian Guard was how it demonstrated the fundamental transformation that Viking society had undergone by the 11th century. These weren't the same raiders who had terrorized European coastlines 3 centuries earlier. They had evolved into sophisticated military professionals who could serve effectively in the most advanced political and military organization of their time. The genetic evidence suggests that many Varangian guardsmen never returned to Scandinavia, instead establishing families and careers within the Byzantine Empire. This represents a form of elite migration that contributed to the cosmopolitan character of medieval Constantinople, while simultaneously reducing the military resources available to Scandinavian kingdoms. The Varangian Guard represents the culmination of Viking military evolution and the final proof of their remarkable adaptability. From raiders to traders to empire builders to elite imperial soldiers, the Vikings had demonstrated a capacity for cultural transformation that was unmatched in medieval Europe. They had proven that they could succeed in any role that required courage, skill, and adaptability. And as the Varangian Guard reached its peak influence in the early 11th century, Viking society was simultaneously undergoing another fundamental transformation that would complete their evolution from raiders to fully integrated members of medieval European civilization. The Christianization of Scandinavia and the consolidation of royal power were creating new political structures that would define Northern European development for centuries to come. The transformation of Viking society during the 10th and 11th centuries represents one of the most remarkable political and cultural revolutions in medieval European history. The same societies that had produced raiders and traders were now developing sophisticated royal administrations, converting to Christianity, and establishing political institutions that would endure for centuries. This wasn't conquest or external pressure, but internal evolution that demonstrated the Vikings' capacity for institutional innovation. The process began differently in each Scandinavian kingdom, but the patterns were remarkably similar. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing centralization of power, the construction of royal administrative centers, and the development of standardized systems of law and governance. These changes occurred simultaneously with Christianization, creating synergistic effects that accelerated political transformation throughout the region. In Denmark, the reign of Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from approximately 958 to 986 CE, marked the beginning of systematic political consolidation. The famous Jelling stones, erected by Harald to commemorate his parents and proclaim his own achievements, declare that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Archaeological excavations at Jelling have revealed the transformation of this site from a traditional pagan cult center to a Christian royal complex, complete with churches, royal halls, and administrative buildings. The construction projects undertaken during Harald's reign demonstrate organizational capabilities that far exceeded earlier Viking political achievements. The Danevirke, a massive defensive earthwork stretching across the base of the Jutland Peninsula, was expanded and strengthened using coordinated labor forces that numbered in the thousands. Archaeological analysis of the construction techniques reveals sophisticated engineering knowledge and project management capabilities. The ring fortresses built throughout Denmark during this period represent another remarkable achievement in medieval military engineering. Sites like Aggersborg, Firkat, and Trelleborg were constructed according to standardized designs that required precise mathematical calculations and coordinated construction efforts. Archaeological dating confirms that these fortresses were built rapidly during a short period in the late 10th century, indicating centralized planning and resource allocation. The administrative innovations developed during this period of royal consolidation had lasting influences on Scandinavian political development. The introduction of written law codes, standardized weights and measures, and systematic taxation systems created governmental structures that were more sophisticated than many contemporary European kingdoms. These institutions provided the foundation for the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms that would dominate Northern European politics for centuries. The Christianization process was equally transformative, though it occurred gradually and with significant regional variation. Archaeological evidence suggests that Christian conversion was often a political decision made by ruling elites, followed by gradual cultural transformation that incorporated Christian elements into existing social and religious practices. This syncretic approach allowed for relatively peaceful religious transition while maintaining cultural continuity. The church-building campaigns that accompanied Christianization represent massive investments in monumental architecture that required sophisticated organizational capabilities and substantial economic resources. The wooden stave churches of Norway, in particular, demonstrate advanced engineering techniques and artistic achievement that rival the greatest architectural accomplishments of medieval Europe. Archaeological analysis reveals that these churches were often built on sites that had previously housed pagan temples, suggesting deliberate efforts to maintain religious continuity while transforming spiritual practices. The economic implications of political consolidation were equally significant. The establishment of royal mints, standardized coinage systems, and regulated markets created more stable economic conditions that encouraged trade and craft specialization. Archaeological evidence from urban centers like Lund, Roskilde, and Sigtuna reveals rapid growth during this period, with specialized craft quarters, international trading facilities, and sophisticated urban planning. The legal innovations of this period had particularly lasting influence on European political development. The written law codes produced in Iceland, Norway, and Denmark during the 11th and 12th centuries represent some of the most sophisticated legal thinking of the medieval period. The Icelandic Gragas, in particular, demonstrates remarkably advanced concepts of individual rights, property law, and judicial procedure that were far ahead of contemporary European legal systems. The social transformations that accompanied political consolidation affected every level of Scandinavian society. Archaeological evidence reveals changing burial practices, household organization, and material culture that reflect the emergence of more stratified social hierarchies. At the same time, legal codes suggest that ordinary farmers retained significant rights and legal protections that were unusual in medieval European societies. The role of women in these transforming societies was particularly complex. Archaeological evidence suggests that women maintained significant economic and social authority, even as political power became increasingly centralized under male rulers. The presence of wealthy female burials, evidence of women's participation in trade, and legal codes that protected women's property rights all indicate that gender relationships in Viking Age Scandinavia were more egalitarian than in most contemporary European societies. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period provide additional evidence of cultural transformation. The development of standardized written forms of Scandinavian languages, the adoption of Latin for administrative and religious purposes, and the increasing influence of Low German in commercial contexts all reflect the growing integration of Scandinavian societies with broader European cultural patterns. The military transformations that accompanied political consolidation were equally significant. The development of royal armies, the construction of permanent fortifications, and the adoption of new military technologies all indicate the emergence of more sophisticated military organizations. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and battlefield sites suggests that Scandinavian military technology during this period was among the most advanced in medieval Europe. The environmental archaeology of this period reveals the scale of landscape transformation that accompanied political and social change. Large-scale forest clearance, the establishment of new agricultural settlements, and the development of intensive farming systems all indicate population growth and economic expansion that supported the more complex political structures. The genetic evidence from this period shows continued population mobility and cultural mixing. but within different patterns than earlier Viking Age movements. DNA studies suggest that political consolidation was accompanied by increased internal migration within Scandinavian regions, as people moved to emerging urban centres and royal administrative complexes. The artistic and cultural achievements of this period demonstrate the sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities that had developed within Scandinavian societies. The elaborate metalwork, wood carving, and textile production revealed by archaeological excavations show influences from across the medieval world, synthesized into distinctive Scandinavian artistic traditions that influenced European art for centuries. The international relationships developed during this period of political consolidation had profound implications for European political development. The Scandinavian kingdoms became active participants in medieval European diplomacy, forming marriage alliances with royal families throughout Europe and participating in international political and military coalitions. The educational and intellectual developments that accompanied Christianization were equally transformative. The establishment of cathedral schools, the introduction of Latin literacy, and the development of historical writing traditions all contributed to intellectual achievements that placed Scandinavian societies at the forefront of medieval European learning. The urban development that occurred during this period created some of medieval Europe's most prosperous and sophisticated cities. Archaeological excavations at sites like Bergen, Stockholm, and Copenhagen reveal urban planning concepts, craft specialization, and commercial facilities that were advanced by any medieval standard. The agricultural innovations developed during this period contributed to the economic prosperity that supported political and cultural transformation. Archaeological evidence reveals the adoption of new farming techniques, crop varieties, and livestock management practices that increased agricultural productivity and supported larger populations. By the mid-12th century, the political transformation of Scandinavian societies was essentially complete. The Viking Age kingdoms had evolved into medieval European monarchies, with sophisticated administrative systems, Christian religious institutions, and cultural achievements that rivaled any contemporary civilization. This transformation had been accomplished not through external conquest, but through internal innovation and adaptation that demonstrated the remarkable flexibility and creativity of Viking Age societies. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. The political institutions, legal traditions, and cultural practices developed during this period influenced European development for centuries. The democratic traditions established in Iceland, the administrative innovations developed in Denmark and Norway, and the urban planning concepts pioneered in Scandinavian cities all contributed to the evolution of European political and social culture. The Vikings had completed their remarkable journey from raiders to empire builders to sophisticated medieval kingdoms. They had proven that societies could transform themselves completely while maintaining their essential character and values. The world they had created through their ships, their trade networks, their hidden empires, and their political innovations would influence the development of European civilization for generations to come. The story of Viking transformation was nearing its end, but its consequences were just beginning to reshape the medieval world in ways that would echo through history and continue to influence our understanding of what human societies could achieve through courage, innovation, and adaptability. Innovation and adaptability. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Viking transformation lies not in their political achievements or military conquests, but in something far more subtle yet profound. The genetic, linguistic, and cultural fingerprints they left across the medieval world. Evidence that continues to reshape our understanding of how civilizations truly influence one another. The DNA evidence emerging from modern genetic studies has revolutionized our understanding of Viking expansion and cultural exchange. Recent comprehensive genetic analysis of medieval remains from across Europe reveals patterns that contradict traditional narratives of Viking conquest and replacement. Instead of finding evidence of large-scale population displacement, geneticists have discovered something far more interesting. The Vikings engaged in extensive cultural mixing that created hybrid populations throughout the regions they visited. In the British Isles, genetic studies reveal Scandinavian ancestry in approximately 6% of the modern population, but this genetic contribution is distributed unevenly across different regions and social classes. Areas that were heavily settled by Vikings, such as the Orkney and Shetland Islands, show Scandinavian genetic contributions exceeding 40% of the population. However, even in regions with lower overall Scandinavian ancestry, genetic analysis reveals that Viking genetic contributions are often concentrated in higher social strata, suggesting that Vikings frequently integrated into local elite networks through marriage and political alliance, rather than conquest. The genetic evidence from Iceland provides perhaps the clearest picture of Viking settlement patterns. DNA studies of the Icelandic population reveal that while the male genetic lineages are predominantly Scandinavian, approximately 60% of female genetic lineages derive from the British Isles, particularly Ireland and Scotland. This pattern suggests that Viking colonization involved Scandinavian men taking wives from populations they encountered during their travels, creating genuinely multicultural settlements rather than purely Scandinavian colonies. The genetic analysis of medieval remains from Eastern Europe tells an equally fascinating story. DNA studies from sites along the Volga and Dnieper trade routes reveal gradual genetic mixing between Scandinavian traders and local Slavic and Finnic populations. This genetic evidence supports historical accounts suggesting that Viking presence in Eastern Europe was primarily commercial and administrative rather than military conquest. The genetic patterns show sustained contact over multiple generations, indicating permanent settlement and cultural integration rather than temporary trading relationships. Perhaps most remarkably, recent genetic studies have identified Scandinavian genetic contributions in populations as distant as the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and even potentially in some Native American populations. While the North American genetic evidence requires additional research and verification, preliminary studies suggest possible European genetic contributions that predate the documented European colonization by several centuries. The linguistic evidence for Viking influence is equally compelling and far more extensive than previously recognized. Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings, contributed hundreds of words to Middle English, including fundamental vocabulary related to law, government, family relationships, and daily activities. Words like law, husband, knife, skill, and anger all derive from Old Norse, demonstrating the depth of linguistic integration that occurred in areas of Viking settlement. The linguistic influence extended far beyond simple vocabulary borrowing. In northern England and Scotland, Old Norse contributed grammatical structures and pronunciation patterns that influenced the development of regional dialects for centuries. Linguistic analysis reveals that in some areas, Old Norse and Old English coexisted as equally valid languages, creating bilingual communities where linguistic mixing produced entirely new dialectical forms. The place name evidence throughout the former Viking world provides additional proof of extensive cultural integration. Thousands of place names in England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Atlantic Islands derive from Old Norse, including major cities like York, derived from Jorvik, and Dublin from Dyflin. These aren't just isolated examples, but systematic patterns that reveal how thoroughly Viking settlers integrated into local landscapes and communities. Archaeological evidence supports these genetic and linguistic findings through material culture studies that reveal extensive cultural exchange rather than cultural domination. Excavations at sites throughout the Viking world show local artistic traditions incorporating Scandinavian elements, while Viking artifacts simultaneously show influences from the regions where Vikings settled. This bidirectional cultural influence created hybrid material cultures that were neither purely Scandinavian nor purely local, but represented genuine cultural fusion. The religious syncretism that occurred throughout the Viking world provides additional evidence of cultural integration rather than replacement. Archaeological evidence from churchyards and burial sites reveals funeral practices that combined Christian and traditional Norse elements well into the medieval period. Stone crosses found throughout the former Viking territories often incorporate traditional Norse artistic motifs alongside Christian symbolism, demonstrating how religious conversion involved adaptation rather than abandonment of cultural traditions. The artistic legacy of Viking cultural exchange influenced European art for centuries after the end of the Viking Age itself. The intricate interlaced patterns, animal motifs, and decorative techniques developed in Scandinavian workshops spread throughout medieval Europe through trade networks and cultural contact. Archaeological analysis reveals Scandinavian artistic influences in metalwork, stone carving, and manuscript illumination from Ireland to Russia, creating international artistic traditions that transcended political boundaries. The technological transfers facilitated by Viking networks had equally lasting impacts on European development. Shipbuilding techniques pioneered by Viking craftsmen influenced naval architecture throughout medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence reveals that clinker-built construction methods spread from Scandinavia to other European maritime regions, improving the performance and reliability of vessels used for both commerce and warfare. Metallurgical techniques developed in Viking workshops also spread throughout their trade networks. Archaeological analysis of iron and steel artifacts from across medieval Europe reveals technological innovations that can be traced to Scandinavian workshops. These technological transfers contributed to improvements in agricultural tools, weapons, and craft production throughout the regions touched by Viking trade. The agricultural innovations that accompanied Viking settlement had profound environmental and economic impacts that persisted long after political control changed hands. Archaeological evidence from Iceland, Greenland, and the North Atlantic islands reveals sophisticated farming techniques adapted to challenging environmental conditions. These innovations in livestock management, crop selection, and land use influenced agricultural development throughout Northern Europe. The urban planning concepts pioneered in Viking trading centres influenced European city development for centuries. Archaeological excavations reveal that Viking trading settlements were typically organised according to functional zones, with designated areas for craft production, commerce, storage, and residential use. These planning concepts were adopted and adapted by later medieval city builders throughout Northern and Eastern Europe. The legal traditions established during the Viking Age had particularly lasting influence on European political development. The democratic assemblies established in Iceland, the commercial law codes developed for international trade, and the property rights systems that protected individual farmers all contributed to legal innovations that influenced European jurisprudence for centuries. The educational and intellectual achievements that emerged from Viking cultural exchange contributed significantly to medieval European learning. The manuscript traditions developed in Iceland, the historical writing that preserved Scandinavian cultural memory, and the scholarly exchanges that occurred in Viking trading centres all enhanced the intellectual development of medieval European civilization. The economic systems pioneered by Viking merchants created commercial practices that influenced European business development for centuries. The standardized weights and measures used in Viking trade, the commercial law codes that governed international transactions, and the credit systems that facilitated long-distance commerce all contributed to the development of medieval European capitalism. The navigational innovations developed by Viking seafarers influenced maritime exploration throughout the medieval period and beyond. archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated navigational tools and techniques that were far in advance of contemporary European practices. These innovations contributed to the European age of exploration that would begin several centuries later. The political institutions established in Viking settlements provided models for governance that influenced European political development. The parliamentary systems developed in Iceland, the administrative innovations pioneered in Normandy, and the federal structures created in the Kievan Rus all contributed concepts that influenced the evolution of European political culture. By the 12th century, the direct political influence of the Vikings was waning as their societies became integrated into the broader European political system. However, the cultural, genetic, linguistic, and institutional legacies of their expansion continue to influence European development in ways that are still detectable today. Modern genetic studies continue to reveal new evidence of Viking influence throughout Europe and beyond. Advanced DNA analysis techniques are identifying previously unknown patterns of migration and cultural exchange that occurred during the Viking Age. These studies are providing increasingly detailed pictures of how Viking expansion influenced population genetics throughout the medieval world. Archaeological discoveries continue to expand our understanding of the geographical extent and cultural impact of Viking activities. Recent excavations have revealed evidence of Viking presence in regions previously thought to be outside their sphere of influence, including new trading sites, settlement evidence, and artifact distributions that demonstrate the truly global scope of Viking networks. Linguistic research continues to identify new evidence of Old Norse influence on European languages. Advanced comparative linguistic analysis is revealing previously unrecognized Norse loanwords and grammatical influences that demonstrate the extensive cultural contact that occurred throughout the Viking world. The technological legacy of Viking innovations continues to influence modern understanding of medieval European development. Archaeological analysis of Viking-era tools, weapons, and craft production techniques provides insights into technological development that influences modern historical interpretation and even contemporary engineering applications. The environmental archaeology of Viking settlements provides increasingly detailed pictures of how Viking activities influenced European landscape development. Studies of pollen, soil composition, and agricultural remains reveal the environmental impacts of Viking settlement and land use practices that influenced European ecological development for centuries. The computational analysis of Viking trade networks has revealed the sophisticated economic systems that connected medieval Europe with distant regions. Network analysis of artifact distributions, site connections, and commodity flows demonstrates the complexity and efficiency of Viking commercial operations that influenced European economic development. The comparative analysis of Viking political institutions has revealed their influence on European governmental development. Studies of legal codes, administrative systems, and political structures established during the Viking Age demonstrate their contributions to European political culture that persisted long after the Viking Age ended. The interdisciplinary synthesis of genetic, archaeological, linguistic, and historical evidence continues to refine our understanding of how the Vikings truly changed the world. Rather than simple conquest or replacement, the evidence reveals complex processes of cultural exchange, technological transfer, and social integration that influenced European civilization in ways that were far more profound and lasting than traditional narratives suggested. The Vikings represented something unprecedented in medieval European history. They were simultaneously warriors and merchants, raiders and diplomats, conquerors and cultural mediators. Their unique combination of maritime technology, commercial innovation, political adaptability, and cultural flexibility allowed them to influence European development in ways that no other medieval civilization achieved. The genetic evidence proves that their influence involved extensive cultural mixing rather than population replacement. The linguistic evidence demonstrates that their cultural impact penetrated to the most fundamental levels of language and communication. The archaeological evidence reveals that their technological and artistic innovations influenced European development for centuries. The historical evidence shows that their political institutions contributed concepts that shaped European governmental evolution. The Vikings didn't just raid and trade. They didn't just build ships and establish settlements. They created something entirely new in human history, a civilization that was simultaneously local and global, traditional and innovative, European and international. They proved that maritime technology could overcome geographical barriers, that commercial networks could transcend political boundaries, and that cultural exchange could create hybrid civilizations that were stronger and more adaptable than their component parts. Their legacy lives on in the DNA of millions of Europeans, in the languages spoken throughout the former Viking world, in the political institutions that govern modern nations, and in the archaeological record that continues to reveal new evidence of their remarkable achievements. The Vikings changed the world not through conquest alone, but through their demonstration that human societies could be simultaneously rooted in local traditions and connected to global networks of exchange and innovation. The transformation they achieved in their own societies, from tribal raiders to sophisticated international merchants to founders of lasting political institutions, demonstrated the potential for human adaptability and cultural evolution that would influence European development for centuries to come. They proved that no society was too remote to participate in global networks, no culture too traditional to embrace innovation, and no political system too established to undergo fundamental transformation. In the end, the Vikings changed the world by proving that change itself was possible. They showed that maritime technology could reshape political geography, that commercial networks could transform economic systems, and that cultural exchange could create new forms of civilization that transcended their origins. Their legacy continues to influence our understanding of how human societies develop, adapt, and transform themselves in response to new opportunities and challenges. The ships that had carried them across unknown seas had become the foundation for global trade networks that connected continents. The trading posts they had established had become the foundations of major European cities. The political institutions they had created had influenced the development of entire nations. The cultural exchanges they had facilitated had enriched European civilization in ways that are still being discovered today. The Vikings had not just changed the world. They had proven that the world could be changed by anyone with sufficient courage, innovation, and adaptability to seize the opportunities that maritime technology and cultural openness could provide. Their story remains one of the most remarkable examples of human potential ever recorded in the archaeological and historical record. And that legacy, written in DNA and language, preserved in archaeological sites and historical documents, embedded in political institutions and cultural traditions, continues to influence our world today. The Vikings had indeed changed everything, and the world they created through their ships, their trade, their hidden empires, and their cultural innovations continues to shape human civilization more than 1,000 years after their longships last sailed into the mists of history. The scale of transformation we've been discussing becomes even more remarkable when we consider the technological innovations that made it all possible. But the Vikings weren't content to simply perfect their shipbuilding. They were simultaneously developing navigational technologies that were centuries ahead of their time, creating tools and techniques that would make their global expansion not just possible, but systematically repeatable. The navigational innovations developed by Viking seafarers represent some of the most sophisticated technological achievements of the medieval period. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Viking navigators used a combination of instruments and techniques that allowed them to traverse open ocean with remarkable accuracy, long before the development of the magnetic compass or advanced cartographic systems. Archaeological excavations at Viking sites have uncovered fragments of what appear to be sun compasses, circular wooden discs with carefully carved markings that could be used to determine direction based on the sun's position. The most compelling evidence comes from a farm excavation in Greenland, where archaeologists discovered part of a circular disc with intricate carvings that match descriptions of solar navigation instruments from later historical sources. The Faroe Islanders, whose ancestors included Viking settlers, preserved knowledge of an instrument called the solski gafjol well into the modern period. Ethnographic studies of this device reveal sophisticated understanding of solar geometry and seasonal variation that would have been essential for long-distance ocean navigation. The mathematical precision required to create these instruments demonstrates that Viking navigators possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and geometry. Even more remarkable was their use of what modern scholars call sunstones, crystalline minerals that could reveal the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover. Laboratory testing has confirmed that certain types of crystal, particularly Icelandic spar, can polarize light in ways that make it possible to locate the sun, even when it's completely obscured by clouds or fog. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings may have discovered and exploited this optical phenomenon centuries before it was understood by modern science. The practical implications of these navigational innovations were extraordinary. They allowed Viking navigators to maintain accurate courses across thousands of miles of open ocean, making the settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and even North America not just possible, but reliably repeatable. This wasn't accidental discovery, but systematic exploration based on sophisticated technological capabilities. The environmental knowledge that Viking navigators developed was equally impressive. They understood ocean currents, wind patterns, bird migration routes, and ice conditions with a precision that allowed them to plan voyages across some of the world's most challenging maritime environments. Archaeological evidence from Greenland settlements reveals detailed knowledge of seasonal ice patterns, animal migration cycles, and weather systems that was essential for survival in Arctic conditions. The intellectual traditions that preserved and transmitted this navigational knowledge were remarkably sophisticated. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking navigators maintained detailed mental maps of ocean routes, coastal landmarks, and navigational reference points that were passed down through oral traditions spanning multiple generations. This represents a form of intellectual achievement that rivals any contemporary civilization. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Viking technological innovation was how it integrated multiple fields of knowledge into unified systems. Shipbuilding techniques, metallurgical skills, navigational methods, and environmental knowledge were all combined into comprehensive technological packages that enabled achievements that seemed impossible to contemporary observers. The metallurgical innovations that supported Viking expansion represent another dimension of their technological sophistication. Archaeological analysis of Viking-era iron production reveals advanced smelting techniques that produced high-quality steel for weapons, tools, and ship construction. The bog iron extraction methods developed in Scandinavia allowed for large-scale iron production that supported both military activities and commercial expansion. The quality of Viking metalwork was recognized throughout the medieval world. Archaeological evidence from trading sites reveals that Scandinavian-produced weapons and tools commanded premium prices in international markets. The pattern-welded swords produced in Viking workshops were considered among the finest weapons available anywhere in the medieval world, combining practical effectiveness with artistic achievement that demonstrated sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. The textile production technologies developed in Viking societies were equally advanced. Archaeological analysis of fabric remains reveals sophisticated weaving techniques, dyeing methods, and fiber processing that produced textiles suitable for both local use and international trade. The production of vadmal, a distinctive woolen cloth, became a major export commodity that was traded throughout the Viking network. The agricultural innovations that supported Viking expansion were particularly important for their colonial activities. Archaeological evidence from Iceland and Greenland reveals sophisticated farming techniques adapted to challenging environmental conditions. These innovations in crop selection, livestock management, and land use allowed Viking settlers to establish sustainable communities in environments that had never previously supported European-style agriculture. The environmental management techniques developed by Viking settlers demonstrate remarkable adaptability and long-term thinking. Archaeological evidence from Iceland reveals that Viking settlers quickly developed sustainable farming practices that prevented the environmental degradation that had occurred in other medieval colonial contexts. This environmental sophistication was essential for the long-term success of their colonial enterprises. The craft production technologies that emerged in Viking trading centers were equally sophisticated. Archaeological excavations reveal specialized workshops for metalworking, bone carving, amber working, and other crafts that produced goods for both local consumption and international export. The standardization of production techniques and quality control methods demonstrates advanced understanding of commercial manufacturing principles. The construction technologies used in Viking settlements reveal architectural innovations that were adapted to local conditions while maintaining Scandinavian building traditions. The stave church architecture developed in Norway represents one of the most sophisticated wooden building traditions in medieval Europe, combining structural innovation with artistic achievement that influenced European architecture for centuries. The preservation technologies that allowed Vikings to maintain food supplies during long voyages and harsh winters were crucial for their expansion activities. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated techniques for smoking, drying, and fermenting foods that allowed for long-term storage without refrigeration. These preservation methods were essential for both maritime expeditions and survival in challenging colonial environments. The communication technologies that maintained connections across the vast Viking network were equally important. The runic writing system, while limited in scope, provided a means of recording information and maintaining communication across long distances. Archaeological discoveries of runic inscriptions throughout the former Viking world demonstrate the extent of literacy and written communication within Viking society. The administrative technologies that managed Viking commercial and political activities reveal sophisticated organizational capabilities. The legal codes preserved in Iceland, the commercial records maintained in trading centers, and the administrative systems developed in Viking kingdoms all demonstrate advanced understanding of governmental and commercial organization. The military technologies that supported Viking expansion combined traditional Scandinavian weapons with innovations borrowed from other cultures. Archaeological analysis reveals that Viking warriors rapidly adopted and adapted military technologies from across the medieval world, creating hybrid military systems that were often superior to their component parts. The transportation technologies that supported Viking land-based activities were as innovative as their maritime achievements. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated sledges, carts, and pack animal systems that allowed for efficient overland transportation of goods and people. These technologies were essential for the portages that connected different river systems and for supplying remote settlements. The energy technologies that powered Viking activities reveal innovative approaches to harnessing natural forces. Watermills, wind power, and efficient fuel use all contributed to the productive capacity that supported Viking expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking settlements often featured energy systems that were more efficient than contemporary European technologies. The information processing technologies that managed Viking commercial activities were remarkably sophisticated. The mental calculation systems used by Viking merchants, the standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade, and the quality assessment techniques that determined commodity values all represent advanced mathematical and commercial knowledge. The risk management technologies that allowed Vikings to operate in dangerous environments reveal sophisticated understanding of probability and contingency planning. The insurance systems that protected trading expeditions, the emergency supply caches that supported long voyages, and the backup navigation methods that provided alternatives when primary systems failed all demonstrate advanced risk assessment capabilities. The quality control technologies that maintained the reputation of Viking products in international markets were essential for their commercial success. Archaeological evidence reveals standardized production techniques, systematic testing methods, and quality certification systems that ensured Viking goods met the expectations of demanding international customers. The timing technologies that coordinated Viking activities across vast distances were crucial for their operational success. The seasonal planning that optimized agricultural and trading activities, the astronomical observations that supported navigation, and the communication systems that synchronized activities across multiple locations all demonstrate sophisticated temporal management capabilities. The resource extraction technologies that supplied raw materials for Viking activities reveal advanced understanding of geology and environmental science. The bog iron mining techniques, the amber collection methods, and the forest management practices that sustained shipbuilding all represent sophisticated approaches to natural resource exploitation. The processing technologies that transformed raw materials into finished goods were equally advanced. The leatherworking techniques that produced high-quality goods for export, the woodworking methods that created both practical and artistic objects, and the food processing systems that added value to agricultural products all demonstrate sophisticated manufacturing capabilities. The packaging and storage technologies that protected goods during long-distance transportation were essential for Viking commercial success. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated containers, preservation methods, and protective systems that maintained product quality during journeys that could last for months across challenging environments. The testing and evaluation technologies that assess the quality and authenticity of traded goods reveal sophisticated understanding of materials science and fraud prevention. The techniques used to evaluate silver content, textile quality, and weapon effectiveness all demonstrate advanced analytical capabilities that were essential for successful international commerce. By the 11th century, these technological innovations had created a comprehensive system of capabilities that enabled Vikings to operate successfully in virtually any environment they encountered. From the Arctic ice of Greenland to the Mediterranean heat of Sicily, from the river systems of Eastern Europe to the open ocean expanses of the North Atlantic, Viking technological systems provided solutions for every challenge they faced. The integration of these various technological innovations into unified operational systems represents one of the greatest technological achievements of the medieval period. Vikings had created what modern analysts might recognize as comprehensive technological platforms that supported multiple types of activities across diverse environmental conditions. The knowledge management systems that preserved and transmitted this technological expertise were equally sophisticated. The apprenticeship programs that trained new craftsmen, the oral traditions that maintained navigational knowledge, and the institutional systems that preserved technical innovations all ensured that Viking technological capabilities continued to advance rather than stagnate. The innovation networks that connected Viking technological centers facilitated rapid dissemination of new developments throughout their sphere of influence. Archaeological evidence suggests that technological innovations developed in one region of the Viking world were quickly adopted and adapted in other regions, creating dynamic systems of technological advancement that accelerated overall development. The testing and refinement processes that improved Viking technologies over time reveal sophisticated understanding of experimental method and systematic improvement. Archaeological analysis shows continuous refinement of ship design, weapon effectiveness, and craft production techniques that demonstrate commitment to technological excellence rather than mere adequacy. The standardization systems that ensured compatibility and interoperability across the Viking network were crucial for their operational success. The standardized ship construction techniques that allowed for repair and maintenance at any Viking port, the uniform weapons specifications that facilitated military cooperation, and the consistent commercial practices that enabled trade across vast distances all demonstrate advanced understanding of systematic standardization. The scalability systems that allowed Viking technologies to support activities ranging from local farming to transcontinental trade were essential for their flexibility and adaptability. The same basic technologies that supported a small farming community in Iceland could be scaled up to support major commercial expeditions or military campaigns involving thousands of participants. The redundancy systems that provided backup capabilities when primary systems failed were crucial for Viking survival in dangerous environments. Archaeological evidence reveals multiple navigation methods, alternative transportation systems, and backup supply arrangements that provided security margins essential for success in high-risk environments. The maintenance systems that kept Viking technologies operational over extended periods reveal sophisticated understanding of preventive care and systematic upkeep. The ship maintenance techniques that extended vessel lifespans, the weapon care methods that ensured continued effectiveness, and the infrastructure maintenance that kept trading centers operational all demonstrate advanced technological management capabilities. These technological achievements enabled the Vikings to create and maintain the most extensive and sophisticated international network of the medieval period. Their technological innovations weren't just individual achievements, but integrated systems that supported complex activities across multiple environments and vast geographical ranges. The archaeological evidence for these technological capabilities continues to expand our understanding of Viking achievements. Recent discoveries have revealed previously unknown aspects of their technological sophistication, while advanced analytical techniques have provided new insights into the capabilities and limitations of their systems. The comparative analysis of Viking technologies with contemporary systems reveals their often superior performance characteristics. In many cases, Viking innovations represented advances that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries, demonstrating the remarkable innovative capacity of their society. The influence of Viking technological innovations on later European development was profound and lasting. Many techniques pioneered by Vikings were eventually adopted throughout Europe, contributing to technological advancement that influenced European development for centuries after the end of the Viking Age itself. The synthesis of archaeological, experimental, and analytical evidence reveals that Viking technological capabilities were far more sophisticated than previously recognized. Rather than representing primitive or rudimentary approaches, Viking technologies often embodied advanced engineering principles and sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena. The recognition of Viking technological sophistication has implications for our understanding of medieval European development more broadly. It suggests that technological innovation was more widespread and more advanced than traditional narratives have acknowledged, and that the foundations for later European technological advancement were established earlier and more broadly than previously recognized. The Vikings had created more than just better ships or more efficient trading systems. They had developed comprehensive technological platforms that enabled them to operate successfully in any environment they encountered, to maintain complex networks across vast distances, and to adapt rapidly to changing conditions and new opportunities. These technological achievements were the foundation for everything else they accomplished. Without their navigational innovations, their global trading networks would have been impossible. Without their metallurgical advances, their military and commercial success would have been unattainable. Without their agricultural innovations, their colonial expansions would have failed. Without their craft production technologies, their commercial dominance would have been unsustainable. The Vikings had proven that technological innovation could overcome seemingly impossible barriers. That systematic development could create capabilities that exceeded anything previously achieved, and that integrated technological systems could enable achievements that transformed entire civilizations. Their technological legacy continued to influence European development long after their political dominance had ended. The navigational techniques they pioneered influenced the age of exploration that would begin centuries later. The shipbuilding innovations they developed influenced naval architecture throughout the medieval period. The commercial technologies they created influenced the development of European capitalism. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings had demonstrated that technological innovation was not the exclusive domain of large empires or wealthy civilizations. They had shown that relatively small societies could achieve technological breakthroughs that enabled them to compete successfully with the largest and most sophisticated civilizations of their time. The technological revolution they created was about to enable the final phase of their global impact. Their innovations in warfare, their mastery of logistics, and their understanding of international politics were about to converge in military achievements that would influence European political development for centuries to come. Development for centuries to come. The military prowess that had made Vikings feared throughout Europe was about to find its ultimate expression in an institution that seemed to contradict everything. The medieval world thought it knew about these northern warriors. The same men who had once terrorized monasteries and trading ports were now being recruited to serve the most sophisticated empire of their age, not as barbarian mercenaries, but as elite professional soldiers whose loyalty and effectiveness would make them the most trusted military force in the Byzantine Empire. The transformation began in the late 10th century, when Viking merchants traveling the Dnieper route encountered something unprecedented in medieval warfare. The Byzantine Empire, despite its wealth and territorial extent, faced a chronic military problem that no amount of gold or political maneuvering could solve. Their traditional military forces, while numerous and well-equipped, lacked the reliability and cohesion necessary for the empire's most critical military operations. What they needed were warriors who fought not for land grants or political advancement, but for professional pride and monetary compensation. Archaeological evidence from Constantinople reveals the scale of this military transformation. Excavations in the city have uncovered distinctive Scandinavian weapons and personal items in contexts that clearly indicate permanent military service, rather than temporary trading visits. The distribution of these artifacts throughout the imperial quarter demonstrates that Vikings weren't just present in the capital, but were integrated into the highest levels of the imperial military hierarchy. The first major test of Viking military effectiveness in Byzantine service came in 988 CE, when Prince Vladimir I of Kiev dispatched 6,000 warriors to assist Emperor Basil II in suppressing the rebellion led by Bardas Phocas. Contemporary Byzantine chronicles describe the performance of these northern warriors in terms that reveal both admiration and amazement. John Skylitzes, writing in the 11th century, recorded that the Viking warriors fought with a discipline and ferocity that exceeded even the empire's most elite native units. What made these warriors so effective wasn't just their individual combat skills, though archaeological evidence suggests these were considerable. Analysis of weapons and armor from Viking graves reveals sophisticated military equipment that was often superior to contemporary European standards. Pattern-welded swords, advanced mail armor, and specialized weapons like the Danish axe all demonstrate technological sophistication that translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. More importantly, the Vikings brought with them military organizational concepts that were revolutionary in the Byzantine context. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites suggests that Viking warriors fought in coordinated formations using standardized tactics that had been developed through generations of warfare across multiple environments. This represented a significant evolution from the individual warrior culture that had characterized earlier Viking military activities. The success of this initial military cooperation led Emperor Basil II to formalize the arrangement by establishing the Varangian Guard around 988 CE. This elite unit, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, became not just the emperor's personal bodyguard, but the empire's most trusted military force for the most critical operations. Byzantine administrative documents reveal that Varangian guardsmen received higher compensation than any other military unit in the empire, along with privileges and access to imperial resources that were unprecedented for foreign warriors. The archaeological evidence from the imperial palace complex in Constantinople provides detailed insights into how the Varangian Guard was integrated into Byzantine military structure. Excavations have revealed specialized barracks, training facilities, and administrative buildings that were specifically designed to accommodate the Guard's unique requirements. The scale and sophistication of these facilities demonstrate the importance the empire placed on maintaining this elite unit. The runic inscriptions discovered throughout Constantinople provide direct evidence of individual Varangian guardsmen and their activities within the empire. The most famous of these, carved into the marble balustrades of Hagia Sophia, reads, "Halfdan carved these runes." Stylistic analysis and archaeological dating confirm that this inscription was made during the height of Varangian influence in the 11th century. The location of this inscription, in one of the empire's most sacred buildings, demonstrates the confidence and status that Varangian guardsmen enjoyed within Byzantine society. The military campaigns undertaken by the Varangian Guard reveal the global scope of their service and the trust placed in them by successive emperors. Byzantine chronicles record Varangian participation in operations from Sicily to the Caucasus Mountains, from the Danube frontier to the deserts of Syria. These weren't just European conflicts, but international military operations that required logistical coordination and strategic thinking on a scale that few medieval military units could manage. Archaeological evidence from these campaign sites provides material confirmation of Varangian military activities. Distinctive Scandinavian weapons and equipment have been discovered at battlefield sites throughout the former Byzantine territories, often in contexts that suggest the Vikings played crucial roles in imperial military operations. The distribution of these artifacts demonstrates that Varangian service extended far beyond ceremonial duties in the capital. The most famous individual Varangian guardsman was Harald Hardrada, who served in the unit from approximately 1034 to 1043 CE before returning to Norway to claim the throne. Byzantine sources provide detailed accounts of Harald's military exploits during his service, including campaigns in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. These chronicles describe military operations that involved sophisticated siege warfare, naval combat, and complex logistical operations that demonstrate the advanced military capabilities of Varangian guardsmen. The wealth accumulation that resulted from Varangian service was legendary even by medieval standards. When Harald finally returned to Scandinavia, Byzantine sources suggest he brought with him treasure that exceeded the annual revenues of most European kingdoms. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts through the discovery of Byzantine gold coins, luxury textiles, and artistic objects in Scandinavian hoards that can be directly traced to imperial workshops in Constantinople. Archaeological excavations throughout Scandinavia have revealed the broader economic impact of Varangian service on northern European societies. Hoards containing Byzantine artifacts appear suddenly in the archaeological record during the period of greatest Varangian activity, often in quantities that suggest systematic wealth transfer from Byzantine service back to Scandinavian communities. These discoveries demonstrate that Varangian Guard service provided access to wealth sources that were completely unavailable through traditional Scandinavian economic activities. The genetic evidence from this period reveals fascinating patterns of population movement and cultural integration that resulted from Varangian service. DNA studies of medieval remains from both Scandinavia and former Byzantine territories show genetic mixing that coincides chronologically with the period of greatest Varangian activity. This genetic evidence suggests that many Vikings who travelled south for military service eventually settled permanently within the Byzantine Empire, while others returned to Scandinavia, bringing Byzantine wives and cultural practices with them. The linguistic evidence for Varangian influence within the Byzantine Empire is equally compelling. Old Norse loanwords appear in Middle Byzantine Greek texts from this period, particularly in military and administrative terminology. These linguistic borrowings weren't superficial adoptions, but reflect genuine cultural exchange that occurred at multiple levels of Byzantine society. Conversely, Greek loanwords began appearing in Scandinavian runic inscriptions during this same period, indicating bidirectional cultural influence rather than simple military occupation. The administrative records that documented Varangian Guard operations reveal sophisticated organizational structures that contradict traditional assumptions about Viking military culture. These warriors weren't undisciplined berserkers, but professional soldiers who operated within complex bureaucratic systems that required literacy, administrative skill, and cultural adaptability. Promotion within the Guard was based on demonstrated competence and experience, with detailed records maintained of individual service histories and achievements. The religious implications of Varangian service were equally significant for both Byzantine and Scandinavian societies. Many Vikings converted to Orthodox Christianity during their service in Constantinople, bringing these new religious ideas back to Scandinavia when they completed their military obligations. Archaeological evidence from late Viking Age burial sites reveals increasing Christian influence in funeral practices, often combined with traditional Norse elements in syncretic religious expressions that reflect this cultural mixing. The technological transfer that resulted from Varangian service had lasting impacts on Scandinavian military development. Warriors who returned from Byzantine service brought with them advanced military techniques, siege warfare knowledge, and strategic concepts that had been developed through participation in some of the medieval world's most sophisticated military operations. Archaeological evidence from later Viking Age fortifications shows clear Byzantine influence in construction techniques and defensive planning. The cultural exchange facilitated by Varangian service extended far beyond military and religious spheres to influence art, literature, and social customs throughout Scandinavia. Returning guardsmen brought with them Byzantine artistic styles, decorative techniques, and cultural practices that became integrated into Scandinavian material culture. Archaeological analysis of late Viking Age artifacts reveals clear Byzantine influences in metalwork, textile production, and decorative arts that demonstrate the depth of cultural interaction that occurred through military service. The diplomatic role played by Varangian guardsmen in Byzantine foreign relations was particularly important for the empire's relationships with northern and eastern European kingdoms. Guard members often served as interpreters, negotiators, and cultural intermediaries in complex international relationships that required understanding of both Byzantine political culture and Scandinavian social traditions. Their unique position as trusted imperial servants who maintained connections to their homelands made them invaluable assets in imperial diplomacy. The economic impact of Varangian service extended far beyond individual wealth accumulation to influence broader patterns of European commerce and monetary circulation. The regular flow of Byzantine gold and silver into Scandinavia through returning guardsmen provided additional liquidity for northern European economies that were already benefiting from extensive trade networks. This monetary circulation contributed to urbanization, craft specialization, and commercial development throughout the Viking world. By the mid-11th century, service in the Varangian Guard had become one of the most prestigious military appointments available to Scandinavian warriors. The social status associated with guard service elevated the families of guardsmen and contributed to the development of military aristocracies in Scandinavian societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that former Varangian guardsmen often became prominent figures in their home communities, using the wealth and prestige gained through imperial service to establish themselves as local leaders. The decline of Varangian recruitment began in the late 11th century as political changes in both Byzantium and Scandinavia reduced the flow of Viking warriors to Constantinople. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 eliminated one major source of guardsmen, while the Christianization and political consolidation of Scandinavian kingdoms reduced the number of warriors seeking military service abroad. Archaeological evidence shows a corresponding decline in Byzantine artifacts appearing in Scandinavian archaeological contexts during this period. However, the institution of the Varangian Guard persisted in modified form well into the 12th century, gradually becoming more international as Byzantine recruitment expanded to include warriors from other European regions. The last definitively Scandinavian references to Varangian service appear in sources from the early 12th century, marking the end of this remarkable chapter in both Viking and Byzantine history. The legacy of the Varangian Guard demonstrates the extraordinary adaptability that characterized Viking society throughout their period of greatest influence. These warriors had successfully transitioned from raiders operating in small bands to professional soldiers serving in one of the world's most sophisticated military organizations. This transformation required not just individual courage, but institutional learning, cultural adaptation, and technological innovation that contradicted simplistic narratives of Viking society as primitive or unchanging. The archaeological evidence from Varangian Guard service sites throughout the former Byzantine Empire reveals the global scope of Viking military influence during this period. From the mountains of Armenia to the coasts of Sicily, from the steppes of Bulgaria to the deserts of Syria, Viking warriors participated in military operations that shaped the political development of medieval Europe and the Middle East in ways that extended far beyond their Scandinavian origins. The institutional innovations that resulted from Varangian service influenced military organization throughout medieval Europe. The concept of professional military service, based on monetary compensation rather than feudal obligation, represented a significant departure from traditional European military practices. This innovation would eventually influence the development of professional armies throughout medieval Europe, contributing to military changes that persisted long after the Viking Age had ended. The Varangian Guard represents the culmination of Viking military evolution and perhaps the clearest demonstration of their capacity for cultural transformation. From raiders to traders to empire builders to elite imperial soldiers, the Vikings had proven their ability to succeed in any role that required skill, courage, and adaptability. They had demonstrated that military effectiveness wasn't just about individual combat prowess, but about organizational capability, cultural flexibility, and the ability to integrate successfully into sophisticated institutional structures. As the Varangian Guard reached its peak influence in the early 11th century, Viking society was simultaneously undergoing the final phase of its remarkable transformation. The same adaptability that had enabled them to serve successfully as imperial guards was now facilitating their complete integration into medieval European civilization through processes of political consolidation and religious conversion that would complete their evolution from raiders to fully developed European kingdoms. The transition was already visible in the archaeological record. The construction of stone churches throughout Scandinavia, the development of urban centers with sophisticated administrative functions, and the emergence of written legal codes all indicated that Viking societies were becoming indistinguishable from other medieval European kingdoms in their political and cultural structures. But this transformation didn't represent abandonment of Viking achievements or capitulation to external pressure. Instead, it represented the logical culmination of centuries of cultural adaptation and institutional innovation that had characterized Viking society from its earliest emergence. The same flexibility that had enabled them to master oceanic navigation, establish global trade networks, build hidden empires, and serve as elite soldiers was now enabling them to create political and cultural institutions that would influence European development for centuries. The genetic evidence from this period reveals continued population mixing and cultural exchange, but within new patterns that reflected the changing political landscape of Northern Europe. DNA studies suggest that the processes of political consolidation were accompanied by increased internal migration within Scandinavian regions, as people moved to emerging urban centres and royal administrative complexes that were becoming the new focal points of social and economic activity. The linguistic changes occurring during this period provide additional evidence of cultural transformation that was simultaneously preserving and adapting Viking heritage. The development of standardized written forms of Scandinavian languages allowed for the preservation of oral traditions, legal codes, and historical narratives that might otherwise have been lost during the transition to more centralized political systems. The archaeological evidence reveals that this transformation was occurring simultaneously across multiple spheres of Viking society. Religious conversion was proceeding alongside political consolidation, while economic specialization was developing in tandem with urban growth. These weren't separate processes, but interconnected changes that were creating entirely new forms of social organization throughout the Scandinavian world. The artistic and cultural achievements that emerged during this period demonstrate that political transformation was enhancing rather than diminishing Viking creative capabilities. The elaborate stone churches, sophisticated metalwork, and complex literary traditions that characterized late Viking Age Scandinavia represent cultural achievements that equaled or exceeded anything produced during earlier periods. The international relationships that Scandinavian kingdoms developed during this period reflected their complete integration into medieval European diplomatic and cultural networks. Marriage alliances with royal families throughout Europe, participation in international military coalitions, and cultural exchange with the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world all demonstrated that the Vikings had successfully completed their transformation from raiders to fully recognized members of European civilization. But perhaps most remarkably, this transformation had been achieved while maintaining the essential characteristics that had made Viking society distinctive. Their emphasis on individual rights, democratic decision-making, and commercial innovation continued to influence the political and economic institutions they were creating. The legal codes developed during this period, the administrative systems that governed their kingdoms, and the commercial practices that regulated their economies all reflected distinctly Scandinavian approaches to governance and social organization. The Vikings had proven that complete cultural transformation was possible without sacrificing the innovations and achievements that had made their society successful. They had demonstrated that adaptability and cultural flexibility could enable societies to reinvent themselves completely while preserving their most valuable characteristics and contributions. As the 12th century dawned, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. But the world the Vikings had created through their ships, their trade networks, their hidden empires, and their cultural innovations was just beginning to reveal its full influence on the course of human civilization. The transformation they had achieved in their own societies would serve as a model for cultural adaptation and institutional innovation that would influence European development for centuries to come. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new dimensions of their achievements, while genetic and linguistic studies provide increasingly detailed pictures of how their influence spread throughout the medieval world and beyond. The Vikings had not just changed the world through their actions, but had proven that human societies possessed almost unlimited capacity for adaptation, innovation, and transformation when they possessed the courage and creativity to embrace new possibilities. Their legacy lived on in the political institutions of the kingdoms they had founded, in the commercial practices they had pioneered, in the technological innovations they had developed, and in the cultural traditions they had established. But perhaps most importantly, they had demonstrated that no challenge was too great, no distance too far, and no transformation too fundamental for human societies that possessed the determination to pursue their vision of what was possible. The story of how the Vikings changed the world was drawing to a close, but the world they had created through their remarkable achievements would continue to influence human civilization for generations to come. They had proven that the course of history could be altered by relatively small groups of people who possessed the vision, courage, and adaptability to pursue ambitious goals despite seemingly impossible obstacles. From the fjords of Norway to the markets of Constantinople, from the ice fields of Greenland to the river systems of Russia, from the battlefields of England to the trading posts of Iceland, the Vikings had left an indelible mark on human civilization that would echo through the centuries. They had changed everything, and the world would never be the same. The culmination of this remarkable transformation reveals itself most clearly in the archaeological record of the 11th and 12th centuries, where we witness something unprecedented in medieval European history. The same societies that had produced the most feared raiders and the most innovative merchants were now creating political institutions that would influence European governance for centuries to come. The process of royal consolidation that swept through Scandinavia during this period wasn't imposed from outside. Archaeological evidence reveals that it emerged organically from the wealth and organizational experience that Vikings had accumulated through their global activities. The silver that flowed into Scandinavia from Islamic markets, the administrative knowledge gained through managing international trade networks, and the political concepts absorbed through service in foreign courts all converged to create new forms of governance that were uniquely Scandinavian, yet internationally sophisticated. The transformation is most visible in the archaeological record from Denmark, where Harald Bluetooth's reign marked the beginning of systematic state building on a scale that had never been attempted in Northern Europe. The Jelling monuments, erected around 965 CE, represent far more than royal propaganda. Archaeological excavation of the site reveals a complete transformation from a traditional cult center to a Christian royal complex that incorporated administrative buildings, ceremonial spaces, and residential quarters designed to accommodate a permanent court. The scale of construction projects undertaken during this period demonstrates organizational capabilities that far exceeded earlier Viking achievements. The expansion of the Danevirke, the massive earthwork that defended the southern approaches to Denmark, required coordinated labor forces, numbering in the thousands. Archaeological analysis of the construction phases reveals sophisticated project management, with different sections built according to standardized specifications that indicate central planning and quality control. The ring fortresses constructed throughout Denmark during Harald's reign represent perhaps the most impressive achievement in medieval Scandinavian engineering. Archaeological excavation at sites like Aggersborg, Fyrkat, and Trelleborg has revealed that these massive circular fortifications were built according to identical mathematical specifications, with precise geometric layouts that required advanced mathematical knowledge and surveying techniques. Carbon dating confirms that all four major ring fortresses were constructed within a remarkably short time period during the late 10th century. The coordination required for simultaneous construction projects of this scale indicates administrative capabilities and resource mobilization that rivals any contemporary European kingdom. Each fortress could accommodate between 500 and 1,000 warriors, along with their equipment and supplies, suggesting that these weren't just defensive installations, but training centers for professional military forces. The standardization evident in these constructions reveals sophisticated understanding of military engineering principles. Archaeological analysis shows that the gate designs, wall construction techniques, and internal layouts were identical across all sites, indicating that construction was supervised by specialist engineers working from standardized plans. This level of technical sophistication contradicts traditional narratives of Viking society as loosely organized tribal confederations. In Norway, the consolidation process took different forms, but achieved equally impressive results. Archaeological evidence from sites like Avaldsnes and Kaupang reveals the development of royal administrative centres that combine traditional Scandinavian architectural elements with innovations borrowed from international contacts. The construction techniques employed at these sites show influences from Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, and even Byzantine building traditions, demonstrating the cosmopolitan knowledge base that Norwegian rulers could draw upon. The legal innovations that accompanied political consolidation had particularly lasting influence on European jurisprudence. The written law codes produced during this period represent some of the most sophisticated legal thinking of the medieval era. Archaeological evidence from Iceland, where these legal traditions were most fully preserved, reveals that the Gragas law code addressed complex issues of property rights, commercial law, and individual liberties that were far in advance of contemporary European legal systems. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 CE, created the first parliamentary democracy in European history. Archaeological excavation at Thingvellir has revealed the physical infrastructure that supported this remarkable political institution. Stone booths provided accommodation for representatives from throughout Iceland, while the law rock served as a natural amphitheatre where legal proceedings could be conducted before assemblies numbering in the hundreds. The sophistication of Icelandic legal procedures is revealed through the preservation of detailed case records in medieval manuscripts. These documents demonstrate that Icelandic courts handled complex commercial disputes, property conflicts, and even international legal issues with procedures that protected individual rights and ensured due process. The fact that these legal innovations were developed without centralized royal authority demonstrates the advanced political thinking that had evolved within Viking society. The economic transformations that accompanied political consolidation created some of medieval Europe's most prosperous and dynamic commercial centres. Archaeological excavations at Lund, Roskilde, and Sigtuna reveal rapid urban development during the 11th century, with specialized craft quarters, international trading facilities, and sophisticated infrastructure that supported populations numbering in the thousands. The craft production evidence from these urban centers demonstrates technological capabilities that were often superior to contemporary European standards. Archaeological analysis of metalworking sites reveals advanced techniques for producing high-quality steel, sophisticated jewelry, and precision tools that were exported throughout the Baltic region and beyond. The standardization of production techniques and quality control measures indicates commercial manufacturing capabilities that anticipated later medieval guild systems. The monetary systems that supported this economic expansion represent another remarkable achievement in medieval Scandinavian development. The establishment of royal mints producing standardized silver coins created stable currencies that facilitated both domestic and international commerce. Archaeological evidence reveals that Scandinavian coins were accepted in markets throughout Northern and Eastern Europe, indicating the economic credibility that these new kingdoms had achieved. The agricultural innovations that supported urban growth and political consolidation demonstrate sophisticated understanding of land management and resource optimization. Archaeological evidence from rural sites reveals intensive farming techniques, improved crop varieties, and livestock management practices that increased agricultural productivity substantially above earlier levels. These innovations provided the economic foundation necessary to support the specialized craftsmen, administrators, and military forces that characterized the new royal administrations. The church-building campaigns that accompanied Christianization represent massive investments in monumental architecture that that required sophisticated engineering knowledge and substantial economic resources. The wooden stave churches of Norway, in particular, demonstrate construction techniques that were among the most advanced in medieval Europe. Archaeological analysis reveals that these churches incorporated structural innovations that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The artistic achievements that emerge from this period of cultural synthesis demonstrate the sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities that had developed within Scandinavian societies. Archaeological discoveries of elaborate metalwork, stone carving, and manuscript illumination reveal artistic traditions that incorporated influences from across the medieval world while maintaining distinctly Scandinavian characteristics. These artistic achievements influenced European decorative arts throughout the medieval period and beyond. The educational and intellectual developments that accompanied Christianization created centers of learning that contributed significantly to medieval European scholarship. The establishment of cathedral schools in Scandinavian cities provided educational opportunities that were comparable to the best available anywhere in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence from these educational centers reveals libraries, scriptoriums, and scholarly facilities that supported intellectual achievements of international significance. The diplomatic relationships that Scandinavian kingdoms developed during this period demonstrate their complete integration into medieval European political networks. Marriage alliances connected Scandinavian royal families with ruling dynasties throughout Europe, while military cooperation and commercial treaties established formal relationships with the most powerful kingdoms of the medieval world. The environmental archaeology of this period reveals the scale of landscape transformation that accompanied political and economic development. Large-scale forest clearance, the establishment of new agricultural settlements, and the development of intensive farming systems all indicate population growth and economic expansion that supported the more complex political structures. Pollen analysis and soil studies show that these environmental changes were managed sustainably, avoiding the degradation that often accompanied medieval agricultural intensification elsewhere in Europe. The technological innovations that emerged during this period of consolidation demonstrate continued Scandinavian leadership in multiple fields. Archaeological evidence reveals advances in metallurgy, construction techniques, and craft production that were often superior to contemporary European achievements. The preservation and development of shipbuilding technologies ensured that Scandinavian vessels remained the most advanced in Northern Europe throughout the medieval period. The international trade relationships that persisted during political consolidation demonstrate that Scandinavian kingdoms successfully maintained their global commercial connections while developing more sophisticated domestic institutions. Archaeological evidence from trading sites reveals continued exchange with the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Western Europe, indicating that political transformation enhanced rather than diminished Scandinavian international influence. The military innovations that accompanied royal consolidation created some of medieval Europe's most effective armed forces. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and battlefield sites reveals standardized equipment, coordinated tactics, and professional training that were often superior to contemporary European military systems. The development of royal armies supported by taxation and professional administration created military capabilities that enabled Scandinavian kingdoms to defend their territories and project power internationally. The linguistic developments that occurred during this period demonstrate the sophisticated intellectual culture that had emerged within Scandinavian societies. The standardization of written languages, the preservation of oral traditions in manuscript form, and the development of scholarly literature all indicate educational and cultural achievements that were remarkable by any medieval European standard. The genetic evidence from this period reveals continued population mobility and cultural mixing, but within new patterns that reflected the changing political landscape. DNA studies suggest that political consolidation was accompanied by increased internal migration within Scandinavian regions, as people moved to emerging urban centers and royal administrative complexes that were becoming the focal points of social and economic activity. The archaeological evidence for social stratification during this period reveals the emergence of more complex hierarchical systems, while preserving many of the egalitarian characteristics that had distinguished Viking society. Legal codes suggest that ordinary farmers retained significant rights and legal protections that were unusual in medieval European societies, while wealthy elites gained access to luxury goods and cultural opportunities that demonstrated their international connections. The religious syncretism that characterized Scandinavian Christianization created unique cultural traditions that incorporated Christian theology with traditional Norse values and practices. Archaeological evidence from church sites reveals the gradual transformation of religious practices rather than abrupt replacement, suggesting that conversion involved adaptation and synthesis rather than cultural abandonment. The urban planning concepts that emerged during this period influenced European city development for centuries. Archaeological excavations reveal that Scandinavian cities were typically organized according to functional zones, with designated areas for craft production, commerce, storage, and residential use. These planning concepts were often more sophisticated than contemporary European urban design and provided models that influenced later medieval city development throughout Northern Europe. The commercial law innovations that supported international trade created legal frameworks that influenced European commercial development for centuries. Archaeological evidence from trading centers reveals sophisticated systems for regulating commerce, resolving disputes, and maintaining commercial standards that were often more advanced than contemporary European commercial law. By the mid-12th century, the political transformation of Scandinavian societies was essentially complete. The kingdoms that had emerged from Viking Age societies possessed sophisticated administrative systems, Christian religious institutions, and cultural achievements that were comparable to any contemporary European civilization. This transformation had been accomplished not through external conquest, but through internal innovation and adaptation that demonstrated the remarkable flexibility and creativity of these societies. The international recognition that Scandinavian kingdoms achieved during this period demonstrates their successful integration into medieval European civilization. Diplomatic correspondence, marriage records, and commercial agreements reveal that these kingdoms were accepted as equals by the most powerful rulers of medieval Europe. The papal recognition of Scandinavian monarchs as legitimate Christian rulers completed their transformation from pagan raiders to respected members of European Christendom. The cultural achievements that emerged during this period of consolidation demonstrate that political transformation enhanced rather than diminished Scandinavian creative capabilities. The literature, art, and architecture produced during this period represent some of the finest achievements of medieval European culture. The preservation of traditional oral literature in written form created literary traditions that influenced European culture for centuries. The technological legacy that Scandinavian kingdoms contributed to medieval European development was equally significant. Innovations in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and craft production continued to influence European technological development long after the end of the Viking Age. The navigational techniques and maritime technologies that had enabled Viking expansion became the foundation for later European maritime exploration and expansion. The economic systems that had supported Viking expansion evolved into sophisticated commercial networks that continued to connect Northern Europe with global markets. Archaeological evidence reveals that these commercial relationships persisted throughout the medieval period, providing the economic foundation for continued Scandinavian prosperity and international influence. The political institutions that emerged from Viking Age societies provided models for governance that influenced European political development for centuries. The democratic traditions established in Iceland, the administrative innovations developed in Denmark and Norway, and the legal systems that protected individual rights all contributed concepts that influenced the evolution of European political culture. The educational and intellectual traditions that developed during this period created centers of learning that contributed significantly to medieval European scholarship. The historical writing that preserved Scandinavian cultural memory, the legal scholarship that codified traditional practices, and the theological works that synthesized Christian doctrine with traditional values all enhanced European intellectual development. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new dimensions of these achievements, while advanced analytical techniques provide increasingly detailed pictures of how political consolidation transformed Scandinavian societies. Recent discoveries have expanded our understanding of the sophistication and international character of these political developments, demonstrating that Viking Age societies were capable of institutional innovations that were often in advance of contemporary European achievements. The genetic studies that trace population movements during this period reveal the complex demographic changes that accompanied political consolidation. DNA analysis shows that urban development attracted populations from throughout Scandinavia and beyond, creating cosmopolitan communities that were often more diverse than contemporary European cities. The linguistic evidence for cultural continuity during political transformation demonstrates that Scandinavian societies successfully preserved their distinctive characteristics while adapting to new political and religious circumstances. The preservation of traditional literature, the continued use of runic writing alongside Latin literacy, and the maintenance of traditional legal terminology all indicate that cultural transformation involves synthesis rather than replacement. The environmental evidence for sustainable development during this period demonstrates that Scandinavian societies managed population growth and economic expansion without causing the environmental degradation that often accompanied medieval agricultural intensification. Archaeological evidence suggests that traditional resource management practices were successfully adapted to support larger populations and more complex economic activities. The comparative analysis of Scandinavian political development with contemporary European systems reveals the innovative character of the institutions that emerged from Viking Age societies. Many of the governmental concepts, legal principles, and administrative practices developed during this period were more advanced than anything available elsewhere in medieval Europe. The synthesis of archaeological, historical, and scientific evidence reveals that the political transformation of Scandinavian societies represents one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval European history. These societies had successfully evolved from tribal confederations to sophisticated kingdoms while preserving the cultural characteristics and institutional innovations that had made their earlier achievements possible. The Vikings had completed their remarkable journey from raiders to traders to empire builders to sophisticated medieval kingdoms. They had demonstrated that societies could transform themselves completely while maintaining their essential character and values. The political institutions they created, the cultural traditions they preserved, and the technological innovations they developed would influence European civilization for centuries to come. Their legacy lived on in the democratic traditions of Iceland, the royal institutions of Denmark and Norway, the commercial practices that connected Northern Europe with global markets, and the cultural achievements that enriched European civilization. But perhaps most importantly, they had proven that human societies possessed almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and innovation when they possessed the courage and vision to pursue ambitious goals. The world the Vikings had created through their ships, their trade networks, their hidden empires, and their political innovations continued to influence European development long after the Viking Age had ended. Their story remains one of the most remarkable examples of human potential ever recorded in the archaeological and historical record, demonstrating that even relatively small societies could achieve transformations that influenced the course of world history. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the markets of Constantinople, from the parliaments of Iceland to the trading ports of the Baltic, from the royal courts of Normandy to the river routes of Eastern Europe, The Vikings had left an indelible mark on human civilization. They had changed everything, and the echoes of their achievements continue to resonate through history, reminding us of what human societies can accomplish when they combine courage, innovation, and adaptability in pursuit of their vision of what is possible. The final chapter of our story brings us to perhaps the most profound realization of all. The Vikings didn't just change the medieval world through their actions. They fundamentally altered the course of human civilization by proving that transformation was possible on a scale that no one had previously imagined. The archaeological evidence from the final centuries of Viking influence reveals something extraordinary. As their political entities matured and their trade networks reached peak efficiency, the Vikings began to export something far more valuable than silver or silk. They began to export ideas, concepts, and institutional innovations that would reshape European civilization for centuries to come. The genetic studies that trace the final phase of Viking expansion tell a story that contradicts everything historians once believed about medieval population movements. Rather than conquest and replacement, DNA analysis reveals sustained cultural mixing that created hybrid populations throughout Europe and beyond. The Viking genetic signature appears not as a conquering wave, but as threads woven into the fabric of medieval society, connecting distant regions through shared ancestry that reflects centuries of peaceful interaction. Recent comprehensive genetic analysis of medieval remains from across Europe has revolutionized our understanding of how the Vikings truly influenced world development. In the British Isles, Scandinavian genetic contributions appear in approximately 6% of the modern population. But this ancestry is distributed in patterns that tell fascinating stories about social integration rather than military domination. The Orkney and Shetland Islands show Scandinavian genetic contributions exceeding 40%, indicating complete demographic transformation through settlement rather than conquest. However, even in regions with lower overall Scandinavian ancestry, genetic analysis reveals that Viking contributions are often concentrated in higher social strata, suggesting systematic integration into local elite networks through marriage alliances and political cooperation. The genetic evidence from Iceland provides the clearest picture of Viking settlement patterns and cultural integration practices. DNA studies reveal that while male genetic lineages are predominantly Scandinavian, approximately 60% of female lineages derive from the British Isles, particularly Ireland and Scotland. This genetic pattern demonstrates that Viking expansion involved systematic cultural mixing rather than simple population displacement. The Eastern European genetic evidence tells an equally compelling story of cultural integration rather than conquest. DNA analysis from sites along the Volga and Dnieper trade routes reveals gradual genetic mixing between Scandinavian merchants and local Slavic and Finnic populations over multiple generations. This genetic evidence supports historical accounts suggesting that Viking influence in Eastern Europe was primarily commercial and administrative rather than military. Perhaps most remarkably, recent genetic studies have identified possible Scandinavian contributions in populations as distant as the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and potentially some Native American groups. While the North American genetic evidence requires additional verification, preliminary studies suggest European genetic contributions that predate documented European colonization by several centuries. The linguistic legacy of Viking expansion provides equally compelling evidence of their global influence on human civilization. Old Norse contributed hundreds of fundamental words to Middle English, including basic vocabulary related to law, government, family relationships, and daily activities. Terms like husband, knife, skill, anger, law, and even the pronoun they all derive from Old Norse demonstrating linguistic integration that penetrated to the most basic levels of communication. The linguistic influence extended far beyond vocabulary borrowing to affect grammatical structures and pronunciation patterns that influenced regional dialect development for centuries. In northern England and Scotland, linguistic analysis reveals that Old Norse and Old English coexisted as equally valid languages, creating bilingual communities where systematic mixing produced entirely new dialectical forms that persist in modern regional speech patterns. The place name evidence throughout the former Viking world provides systematic proof of extensive cultural integration rather than temporary occupation. Thousands of place names in England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Atlantic Islands derive from Old Norse, including major urban centres that became focal points of medieval European development. These aren't isolated examples, but comprehensive patterns that reveal how thoroughly Viking settlers integrated into local landscapes and communities. Archaeological evidence supports these genetic and linguistic findings through material culture studies that reveal extensive bidirectional cultural exchange rather than one-sided cultural domination. Excavations throughout the Viking world consistently show local artistic traditions incorporating Scandinavian elements, while Viking artifacts simultaneously display influences from the regions where Vikings settled. The religious syncretism that occurred throughout the former Viking territories provides additional evidence of cultural integration rather than replacement. Archaeological investigations of churchyards and burial sites reveal funeral practices that combined Christian and traditional Norse elements well into the late medieval period. Stone crosses found throughout former Viking territories often incorporate traditional Norse artistic motifs alongside Christian symbolism, demonstrating religious conversion that involved adaptation rather than abandonment of cultural heritage. The artistic legacy of Viking cultural exchange influenced European decorative arts for centuries after the end of direct Viking political control. The intricate interlaced patterns, animal motifs, and decorative techniques developed in Scandinavian workshops spread throughout medieval Europe through trade networks and cultural contact. Archaeological analysis reveals Scandinavian artistic influences in metalwork, stone carving, and manuscript illumination from Ireland to Russia, creating international artistic traditions that transcended political boundaries. The Vikings accomplished something that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. They didn't just raid and pillage their way across medieval Europe. They created the first truly global economy, connected civilizations that had never before been in contact, and left genetic, linguistic, and cultural fingerprints that continue to influence our world more than 1,000 years after their longships disappeared into the mists of history. The archaeological evidence tells a story that contradicts everything we thought we knew about these remarkable people. Their clinker-built ships weren't just vessels of war, but precision instruments that enabled the first systematic exploration of the globe. Their trade networks didn't just move goods, but ideas, technologies, and genes across vast distances. Their political institutions didn't just govern territories, but pioneered democratic concepts that would reshape European civilization. From the DNA in our cells to the words we speak, from the cities we inhabit to the political systems that govern us, the Viking legacy surrounds us still. They proved that human societies could transform themselves completely while maintaining their essential character. They demonstrated that no distance was too great, no challenge too formidable, and no transformation too fundamental for people with sufficient courage, innovation, and adaptability. The world they created through their remarkable achievements continues to influence human civilization today. They changed everything, and we're still discovering just how profound that change truly was.